Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode we're talking about the New Orleans Saints 2024 NFL Draft Class review based on data. So we're going to look at production, athleticism, and other statistical factors to determine how well they did in this particular draft class. To learn more about the data stuff that I do, you can go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/jcoburn. You can also check out my other work on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Geometrics. And I would highly recommend you check out my top 50 prospects video, where I go over all of the correlations. And I think it's probably one of my better videos in terms of explaining all the correlations, how everything stacks up per position. So definitely check that out. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's get to the Saints' needs. So based on the approximate value data research I've been able to do on the roster, these are the top prospects for the Saints. The biggest issue that the Saints face is a lot of their top end prospects are very old. Demario Davis, for example, is going to be 35 years old this year. Derek Carr is 33. Tyrann Mathieu is 32. Ryan Ramczyk is going to be 30. So there's a lot of really good prospects on the Saints, but they're also older. And as a result, you need to start thinking about how to fix those positions. So the top needs based on data. So based on a talent basis and an age basis, these are the top needs. And the offensive position is probably the biggest need area. They definitely need a quarterback of the future. They need a running back of the future. They need wide receiver help, tight end help, and offensive line help. Those are really crucial areas that they need to improve from a long-term standpoint on the roster. Then when you get to the defensive side of the football, the defense is a little bit better, but the defensive tackle position does need improvement, and also the safety position. So those are the biggest areas that I think the Saints should address in this particular draft class in terms of long-term outcomes. There will be some people who will say, well, even though they're old, they'll still perform well, which is true, but the older you get, Father Time will eventually catch up to you in terms of increased injuries, and just regular play fall off. So NFL players don't last forever, so you have to start preparing for the future, and the draft is one of the first places that you should go to get younger prospects that eventually could fill needs. So with that out of the way, the last part to discuss is the biggest factors in terms of my final grade. When I do my roster evaluations, I look at one, what are the biggest needs? Did they meet their roster needs? So if there was a player that was taken at a position that really wasn't the biggest need for them, then that would be kind of an issue in terms of the grading of the draft class. Also, did they draft good prospects? Because if you don't draft good prospects, you're going to end up having to draft more of them in the future. So one way that I judge good prospects is prospects that have above average data grades. So if you want to learn more about the data grades, like I said, you can go to my top 50 prospects video. You can go to other videos I've done in the past as well. Any of my draft review videos in the past, I've done an explanation of that. But the basics of it is that the vast majority of long-term starters at the NFL level typically have a 70 or higher data grade. About 86 to 90% of those starters, depending on the position, had a 70 or higher grade. So if there's a prospect that has below a 70 data grade, that's a prospect that could work out, but it's a very low statistical chance of that happening. So if they were to break out, they would be considered an outlier in the data. We also have to look at the fact that, did they draft prospects that have the data potential to outperform their draft status? So one thing that's different in terms of my draft grades is I'm looking to see, did they draft players that can outperform their draft status? There's a lot of people who will criticize some of my grading saying, well, this person was for special teams or he was going to help on special teams. And the thing is special teams is great, but special teams is not really as valuable as a starting center, as a starting quarterback, as a starting running back. Those positions are way more valuable than a special teams player. So you're always going to be able to find camp bodies in terms of undrafted free agency, but the players that really should be drafted in the sixth, the fifth, the seventh round are players that could potentially become starters because they're going to have much more value for the team if they have that potential. And if their only highest potential is as a special teams ace, you probably shouldn't have drafted them based on approximate value, based on the value that they can bring to the team. Probably shouldn't have drafted them. Now, with all those questions out of the way, let's start with the first pick for the Saints. And pick 14 in terms of Talise Fuaga. His data grade was 97.85 out of 100. His floor is 89.80 with a balance grade of 93.82. The data grade or ceiling grade is essentially the average highest grade for a prospect who tested like him based on all of his data. So based on his physical metrics, his athleticism, all those other traits, that is sort of the average grade that he would get. He could be better, he could be worse, but that's the average for his ceiling, if you will, his upside potential. The floor grade is based on where he was selected at and players who tested like him in that area, so 95 to 99 plus percentile offensive linemen. What was the average AV that they brought to the table? Average approximate value is 89.80 out of 100. So that's like the bottom end average for offensive linemen taken at that spot who tested similar to him. And then the balance grade essentially marries the ceiling with the floor, giving you a generalized grade for him as a prospect. The overall pick AV, which you can see right there, is 92.28. That's the average approximate value for a prospect taken at pick 14. So if you just randomly selected a player there, that's what the expectation is. And because of that, Fuaga got an A. He has a tremendously high data grade overall and 97 percentile in terms of that particular area. And he was taken at a spot where most of the time you usually only get a 92 percentile prospect. So because of that, it's an A grade. On top of that, when you look at his athleticism traits, he was tremendous. He had a 96 percentile explosion score and an 86 percentile speed score, and also has all the other physical metrics you're looking at the position. So overall, this was probably one of the Saints' best picks in this particular draft class because of all of his data pointing to really high quality outcomes. Then, of course, we get to pick 41 and Kool-Aid McKinstry, cornerback out of Alabama. His data grade was 95.56 out of 100. His floor is 70.67 with a balanced grade of 83.12. The average AV of a person selected at 41 is 88.03. Overall pick grade, I would give this as an A based on his data grade, his ceiling in terms of how he tested, regardless of his draft status. Good overall data for him. And when you get to his production traits, 61 percentile in terms of his solo tackle data, 58 percentile in terms of interception data, and 80 percentile in terms of pass deflection data. All those numbers pretty much hit within the starter averages and Pro Bowl averages at the position for the most part. And then when you get to athleticism traits, he had above average explosiveness, above average speed. But the biggest sticking point to Kool-Aid McKinstry comes down to his adjusted production trait. So adjusted production takes a look at the school that he played at. It looks at strength of schedule, strength of team, and the age of a prospect to see how well they performed for their level of competition, for how old they were, and who they faced. And because Kool-Aid McKinstry was that productive that we just saw at a high-end school, it increases his chances of becoming a long-term successful prospect. So based on all that information, Kool-Aid McKinstry would be an A grade here. He has the potential to be a 90 plus percentile starter at the position, and this is overall a pretty decent pick for the Saints. Then, of course, we get to pick 151 and Spencer Rattler, quarterback out of South Carolina. His data grade is 60.39 out of 100. His floor is 42.89 and balanced grade is 51.64, with the overall pick AV here being 51.35. I would give this overall grade here a D based on his ceiling grade. When you take at Spencer Rattler in terms of his mobile quarterback score, he's not the most mobile quarterback ever. He's above average, but not exactly elite in terms of that. I mean, nobody's expecting him to be like Lamar Jackson. And in terms of his quarterback efficiency traits, he actually did pretty decently. He had a 97 percentile best quarterback efficiency score with a 76 percentile career quarterback score. And I know there's a lot of controversy with Rattler because of a lot of off the field things, maturity, those types of things. But in many ways, Rattler tested with guys like Michael Penix Jr., with Bo Nix, with other quarterbacks that went much higher than him. And when you look at the situation with the quarterback right now in Derek Carr and Spencer Rattler actually tested very similar as prospects coming out. So because of that, I would say that Spencer Rattler might end up becoming the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints long term. So we'll see what happens with that. But he did have data that was at least decent enough to potentially become a long-term starter. I don't expect him to be an All-Pro, Pro Bowl player. He might go to a couple Pro Bowls if he actually starts to win a starting job there. But that's the general feelings with Rattler is where he was selected. There is usually a low success rate, but he's going into a situation with a quarterback in Derek Carr with an overall depth chart kind of situation there where I could see him potentially emerging as a starter at some point, maybe following in the footsteps of, say, like Sam Howell, of course, who was on the Washington Commanders. So keep an eye out for that. I think this is a good pick because of that. Again, I don't expect him to be a special quarterback prospect long term, but he is somebody that could become a starter and put some good time in there for the Saints. Then, of course, we get to pick 170, and Bub Means, wide receiver out of Pittsburgh. His data grade was 78.74. His floor is 38.32 with a balance grade of 58.53. The overall AV of a player selected here is 18.53. The pick grade I would give them is a C. When you take a look at his production traits, his production wasn't the best overall. He had really good touchdown production, but not really the best in terms of receiving uh, production and total offensive market share production. But when you look at his efficiency scores, he did have above average efficiency. And athletically speaking, he was one of the more athletic wide receivers with a 94 percentile explosion score and a 93 percentile speed score. So he has great athleticism traits for the position with inconsistent production. And when you look at his adjusted production traits, that's where things get a little bit scary. Is he is a bit of an older prospect, and when you look at the starter averages, the Pro Bowl averages, and the All Pro averages, at the position, he doesn't quite hit near those areas. He is going to a situation where the Saints do have kind of a weak roster in terms of their overall wide receiver prospects. So that's going to be something to kind of look at there. You know, other than Chris Olave, they don't have a lot of options there at the wide receiver position that are really strong options from a data perspective or from how they actually performed. So he could be somebody who emerges, but based on his overall data, I would say he kind of is a long shot to kind of get onto the roster, but we'll see. Then, of course, you get to pick 175 and Jalen Ford, linebacker out of Texas. His data grade is 95.07 out of 100. His floor is 48. His balance grade is 71. And the overall pick AV here would be 10.81 out of 100. Overall pick grade I would give them is a A. Taking a look at his production traits, he had an 85.67 solo tackle score with a 47 percentile sack score and 73 percentile in terms of tackles for loss. Based on his production data, he pretty much hits all the areas that you're looking for in terms of a long-term linebacker prospect. Taking a look at his other market share production scores in terms of forced fumbles, pass deflections, and interception data, hits really good areas there too. And when you look at athleticism traits, he hits all the areas that you're looking for in terms of starting potential, athletically speaking. And then looking at adjusted production, he's within range of Pro Bowl and All Pro averages. Jalen Ford is probably one of their better value selections because of where he was selected. He has good production, he has good athleticism traits, and an overall decent age profile of everything else. So he could be somebody that could emerge as a starting linebacker long term. And I do think he will do well for them in that capacity. Then, of course, you get to pick 199 and Christian Boyd, defensive tackle out of Northern Iowa. His data grade is 50.67. His floor is 29.52 with a balance grade of 40.09 out of 100. Pick AV would be 20.85. Overall grade for this one would be an F, mainly because of his data grade. When you take a look at his production traits, he did decently in terms of solo tackle, sack, and TFL data. When you look at his other market share production traits in terms of pass deflections, interceptions, he was above average in those areas as well. But when you look at his athleticism traits, he has below average speed, below average flexibility. And when you look at his adjusted production traits, his production for his level of competition is not getting it done because even though he was relatively productive at Northern Iowa is not an FBS program. They are not a program that has a high quality of, strength of schedule and strength of team kind of metrics in terms of that. So in other words, he didn't play at Alabama, he didn't play at Tennessee. So even though his production is decent in terms of the raw numbers, when you look at other defensive tackles from that level of competition, they usually produce a lot better. They usually have better athleticism traits and better all-around traits. So because of all that, he's probably more likely going to be a backup to rotational guy, but there are some positives in terms of his overall profile. So again, it is a F. Where he was selected, I don't think you can, hate it too much because again, his overall upside would be like a 50 percentile type of prospect, but I think you could have got better value there with a different prospect. Then, of course, the last pick of the draft for the Saints is in pick 239 in Josiah, offensive tackle out of Eastern Kentucky. His data grade is 89.82. His floor is 45. His balance grade is 40. And the overall pick AV is 20.85. Overall pick grade for this would be a B plus. Taking a look at his athleticism traits, he had a 92 percentile speed score, which is pretty decent. And when you look at the All Pro averages and the Pro Bowl averages and starter averages at the position, pretty much hits within what you want there. Now, there is the concerns about, he played at Eastern Kentucky. Is he going to be able to develop into a decent starter long term? Those are definitely questions that are a bit of a concern, but where he was selected and his overall upside, this is the type of pick that you should be making in the seventh round. So there is risk involved with this selection, but where he was selected, it's already baked in to it. When you draft a guy in the seventh round at the 250th pick, they're most likely not going to be much long term based on the statistical data. So because of that, you've got a player who could potentially become a starter based on his overall data or better. So that's what makes it such a great selection for them. Finally, the overall final grade for the New Orleans Saints, I would give them a B plus. Did they meet all their roster needs? I would say yes and no. Did they draft good prospects? Yes and no. Did they draft prospects that have the data potential to outperform their draft status? Yes and no. The Saints added a decent number of high quality starters, but they also had a few missteps in day three based on data. So not every single selection they had was on par with what you want to have in terms of a draft class. There are some question mark prospects here and there, but overall, it was a pretty solid all around draft class. I think, Fuaga is going to be a mainstay on the offensive line. I think Spencer Rattler definitely has potential to become a long term starter. There's a lot of prospects in here that have decent potential to, become starters for them. But the Saints still have a lot of roster needs, so I don't really see this draft class turning the Saints around immediately. They still need to have a couple more really good drafts long term, but this was a good start to add some foundational players for them. So with all this stuff out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Jim Coburn. You can check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/jcoburn. Also, consider following my X, formerly known as Twitter account at Geometrics, and purchase the 2024 NFL Draft Class Analytics Guide available today. 678 pages of high quality data content. The vast majority of the prospects that I talked about today is in the guide. So if you want to learn more about the prospects I just talked about, I would definitely consider buying that guide. And with all that stuff out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.